The following is a presentation of Project Independence and WCWP. Project Independence is the Aging in Place initiative of the town of North Hempstead.
Welcome to Project Independence and You.
Good morning and welcome to Community Talk Radio. This is Project Independence and You on LIU Public Radio. I'm your host and producer, Kristina Liu, along with my fabulous co-host today, Otto Lohse, who's a longtime volunteer, supporter, and friend of Project Independence. And this morning, we'll be talking to Dr. Arturo Hernandez, who is an author, a professor of psychology at the University of Houston. And we're going to talk all about these 6 secrets to building brain power. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Hernandez.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Well, our population is geared towards seniors. Obviously, our listeners is people who work with seniors largely. So we, of course, in our field, always hear the sayings, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I'm too old to change. And I loved when I came across your incredible books, is that you're never too old to learn something new or to master it. So I'd really love to get into your backstory and how you got in this whole field of mastering your skill.
Yeah. So as I detail in my book, Mastery: How Learning Transforms Our Brains, Minds, and Bodies, the backstory really is I'm a sort of lifelong language learner. And so I grew up in a family that was Spanish speaking in the US. So I was born in Berkeley. And my parents spoke Spanish at home. I spent a lot of time going to Mexico and the United States. I learned Spanish and English simultaneously. Then decided at 20 to learn Portuguese because I fell in love with Brazilian music. I learned the language and I went abroad for 2 years. And then when I was older, because of work, I encountered German and took my hand at that. And that is a challenge to do. So it is true that things change with age, I agree, but it's still possible to learn new things, but it is different, I will say.
My exposure to language is very poor, to be blunt about it. I not like you. You've had the, in some respects, the good fortune of moving to different locations and using different languages. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. My parents were from Germany, and I spoke some German in the early years. And then when I went to high school, I had to make a decision on what language I was going to take. And I figured, well, German, it would be so easy to be nothing to it. And that was a big mistake. I found out very early in the game that there are a lot of different dialects. And my parents came from the very north part of Germany and spoke Plattdeutsch, which like nobody else in Germany talks. So I was at a complete loss for 2 years. And I really struggled, did not do well. And one of the things I felt was not good was the focus on learning German was strictly grammar. We never had a conversation. It was always ich bin, du bist, whatever, all these different grammatical rules. And we never, looking back on it, we never really talked about, the language. So like you learned Spanish, you didn't learn about grammar in the beginning. You straightened that all out later. What is your perspective on that?
So I guess what I'll say is, and I've said this before, right? Adults are better language learners than children. And people look at me often and they say, wait, what do you mean? How's that possible? And exactly for the reason that you said. They can give you a grammar book. So someone who knows no German, right? You already spoke German as a child. So you had this expectation of being able to have a conversation. But for somebody who's an adult going straight cold into German, you give them some grammar, you give them some vocabulary, they can have very basic conversations very quickly. So the upside is quick. The downside, as you noted, is over time, right? Kids who learn a language will actually speak it, and eventually they'll later learn the grammar, they'll learn the rules, and they'll know why they say what they say. Mm-hmm. So I think in a way, the system is set up to teach adults a language, right? And it's fast. But for you, you actually spoke it as a child. So your expectations was, well, I want to go back to starting where I left off, not starting anew. And I think that was the disconnect for you between what you did as a child and what you were doing now in this classroom. But for a cold learner, right, someone who doesn't know anything, they get in pretty quickly with these basic rules. So it's kind of interesting that for you, it didn't do what it was supposed to do. And for others, they felt like, hey, I know a little bit.
One of my wishes that I wish I took Spanish then, because I wish I could speak Spanish now today, because there's so many opportunities in life. I like to play golf. A lot of the people who work there speak Spanish. I would love to talk with them, but I can't. And
Well, it's never too late, Otto. That's what we're learning.
at 87 years old, can I learn Spanish?
You can. You can. And I think what you're hitting on, for me at least, I think there are different types of language learners. That's the first thing I would tell you, right? Some people, they like grammar. So you'll find this happens sometimes in immigrant families. There's always somebody, well, that was my mom. So my mom, she taught me English grammar. So she's an English non-native speaker. She learned it at 19, but she taught English as a foreign language for 30 years. So she would tell me every rule. For example, parallel. Why is it parallel, not parallel? Oh, because it has a double consonant. I learned that like at 7 or 8. It has a double consonant. The vowel before it sounds blunt. Like, okay, like, what do I know? I'm just saying parallel. I don't know what it is, right? So she knew the rules and she can tell you. In fact, I asked her today what the rules are, and she says American English has no rules. It's changing so fast. But anyway, that's my mom. Some people learn through rules, and she's really good at that. Some people learn through feel, right? So some people want to talk to others. It sounds like you're more of an extrovert, like you like talking to people. And so I think it's important for you to realize that you have to find your path to learning it. It does help to have some classes or to have a little bit of vocabulary. But my encouragement for you is just go talk to them. Start with a couple of phrases. Start with asking them some questions and do it slowly. And as you move slowly through your engagement with them, you'll begin to start to speak more. But you sound like you want to talk to people. So maybe learn a few basic things and then just start small and build from there, little by little. And eventually you might have that my goal in German was to be able to write an email, like a 2-line email in German. It took a while. I got there. It's not a big goal, but I think if we settle for small goals and start, then that's what's important.
Yeah, well, what inspired you to write Mastery?
Yeah, I mean, the inspiration was really in part because in my previous book, The Bilingual Brain, I had some ideas about learning in general, about the effect of age, about the fact that we kind of practice these small things and they build up into bigger things. And so when I thought about other things that I did in my life, for example, I play tennis. I love tennis. And I felt when I was practicing tennis, I was doing a lot of the same types of things. I was practicing a forehand or a backhand or a volley or an overhead or a little piece of a serve. And it was similar to what I was doing in German, where I was practicing some sounds or some sound pattern or a grammatical rule. And so I began to think about how we learn in general. And it became clear to me that my ideas about language learning also applied to learning in general. And that's where Mastery was born.
Yeah.
It would be that you do have some innate skills, I think, that, we're all born with. And maybe language isn't one of my innate skills, but like you mentioned tennis as an example. Like you, I read your background, and I played every game you can think of when I was a kid. I loved to play sports, and I played street games, and I played basketball on teams and baseball on teams and a whole bit. And when I was in the Navy, I was 19 years old. And there was a guy there who, I never played tennis in my entire life. And there was a guy there who loved tennis, and he wanted so badly to play with somebody. So I took it up with him. I played every day for 2 months, and I got pretty good because I just had the ability and I had the exposure to practice it. But I never played after that. because I never had people to play with. But I think all I'm saying is I agree with what you said in some of your book about practice also. Your exposure and your practicing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. Tennis is a late developing sport, a little bit. Golf is kind of like that too, right? So there's a lot of basic things you have to do before you get to the full-blown tennis game, which is more like an adolescent game than it is a little kid game. I mean, they're trying to make it easier for children. So I think that's an interesting point. But I think the other point you're bringing up is there are a lot of things that you already know that are laying around in your sort of toolbox. And I think a lot of times people focus on what they want to learn, like the big thing, like I want to learn a language or I want to learn a new sport. And they don't think about all the little things they have sitting around that might help them with the big things. And so you had a lot of little sports, and the same happened to me. I didn't start playing tennis seriously till 16. And I picked it up pretty quickly. I still play kind of funny. I look at my daughter, she plays, I mean, women always play more beautifully than men anyway. Sorry, I'll make that comment. It's just a prettier game than it is for men. Men tend to be jerkier and anyway. But anyway, that comment aside, it looks funky when I look at it. It doesn't look like someone who started young. There's some kind of jerkiness in there. And I think it's from the other sports I learned as a kid, like you, that I kind of put together into this thing that I call tennis now, just like you did.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at me play golf, all right, I love to play golf. I've gone through all the things in my life, take lessons, do this, do that. The one thing I really never did was I never really liked practicing. I didn't like going to the driving range. I really didn't put a lot of, I tried occasionally, I'd go in spurts, but overall, no, I just really like to just go out and play. So you have a limit. And when you look at your own swing, you realize, like you described, jerky, very bad jerky swing. So I don't know how much mastery I could do over that. That, I guess, is the bottom line.
I mean, I think it's important to note that, I have an uncle in Mexico, as a tennis coach, right? So that's what he does. And he told me, there's a difference between sort of what it looks like and how functional it is, right? And he always says, functionally, it might not look good. I mean, they're tennis players. You look at professional tennis players, and you're like, how do they do that? Like, nobody taught them to play. No, you would never teach a person to do that. Several of them, people that have won Grand Slams, I mean, really good. So my uncle always reminds me, functionally, like, what's the functional result of that? Even though it may not look aesthetically beautiful, it may be functionally just fine. So I think in the end, does it get the job done?
And thinking in line with that, I know one of the things with golf or any sport, as far as that goes, if you think too much about how you're going to do it, as opposed to doing it, it doesn't work. You get too caught up
Your head,
here
right?
with the mechanics. And like you just said, I agree completely. The functioning, does it get the job done? I guess is the key thing.
I mean, you can look at analysis of people who pros. I mean, you go on these websites, they'll get down to the nitty-gritty of, are their elbow angles right? Are they using their energy correctly? Is their form perfect? They'll get into that. And there's some people that they have weird technique, but they get the job done. I think the other thing we have to realize, right, is there's always a trade-off between a strength and a weakness, right? What you can do well, what you can't do. It doesn't matter how good someone gets. There's always what people would perceive as a weakness, right? And a strength. And that's just part of being human, right? We're not perfect. We can't, we have limitations, how we physically move, how our tongues move if we're talking, how we perceive sound. Everything is always filtered. And so it's just part of being human. And I guess part of the beauty, at least the way I see it.
Well, yeah, and I agree with you on like one of the things that my philosophy in life is you don't pick your entry level in life. You could be born anywhere and you could look like anybody or anything or have disabilities or whatever. There's no checklist that you check off when you come in. So I always try to tell people, look, it's no big skill on your part. You're lucky. All right. You're entry level. You had a good entry level. We're all at a good entry level. And that's a blessing. It's not a skill. So what you do, in my opinion, what you do with your entry level, applying it to your thinking with mastery, we all have a certain, I believe, a limit, but what you do with your entry level, to me, is really what matters.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree.
And
Yeah.
we love on the show, Dr. Hernandez, which I think you're already doing, is like we call them our golden nuggets, right? We want people who are listening to walk away from the show with some concrete ways and learning something new for their toolbox. So in mastery, I know you talk a lot about the different 5 principles to mastering a certain skill. So I'd love to dive into all that and how that kind of goes.
Yeah, so the 5 principles are will, ability, opportunity, flexibility, and clarity. And the only one that doesn't rhyme, they all rhyme in Spanish, but they don't rhyme in English. So that's why will is different, but all of the other ones rhyme. So will is basically the idea of like, what do you like to do? So, and I like to use the example I use in the book is of James Clark. So he's the founder of Netscape, right? Also Sun Microsystems, so Silicon Valley guru who founded lots of different companies. And he dropped out of school. So he actually dropped out of school, high school. High school and him agreed that they were not good for each other. He got into the Navy. He went to the Navy and discovered that he really liked math. So he found his ability, which was math. He ended up getting a PhD in computer science, studied physics at night school while he worked, eventually got a PhD in computer science, ended up as a professor, right? So he got an opportunity from a professor who sponsored him in graduate school, and then opportunity from Stanford. Eventually he realized, I don't like this professor thing so much. It's too rigid for me. I want to be an entrepreneur. So again, flexibility. He switched out into industry and founded Netscape, Sun Microsystems, as I said earlier. And then eventually, the really hard one is clarity, right? And for some people,
Well, I'm going to have to stop you right there. And all of our listeners are going to be holding that thought, because after the break, we are going to continue talking with Dr. Arturo Hernandez, who's an author and professor of psychology at the University of Houston, all about the 6 secrets to building brain power. You're listening to Project Independence and You on LIU Public Radio.
WCWP is your home for great music and great conversation. You'll find all that and more on WCWP.org. Listen live on the web, check out the lineup, subscribe to podcasts, and stay up to date on the latest station events. Get in touch with us and let us know if you like what you're hearing. And find out how you can support or get involved at the only community public radio station serving Nassau's North Shore. Plus, sign up to get a free bumper sticker. It's all online at WCWP.org.
Welcome back to Project Independence and You on LIU Public Radio. I'm your host, Kristina Liu, along with my co-host, Otto Lohse. We're going to continue talking with Dr. Arturo Hernandez, author and professor of psychology at the University of Houston, all about building brain power, and his book, Mastery: How Learning Transforms Our Brains, Minds, and Bodies. So let's dive right back into it. Before the break, we were talking about the first principle of will, and now we were diving into clarity.
Right. So the 5 principles were will, ability, opportunity, flexibility, and then clarity. Clarity, I think, is the hardest one. For some people, they have a clear goal from the outset. They know what they want to do. It's very clear to them at a young age. For other people, the clarity comes and goes. I would put myself in that second stage where people are kind of searching for something. They have clarity. Suddenly things make sense to them. And then they dive in, and then things kind of get fuzzy again. So I think it's kind of a circular thing where you're going through these different phases, and you have moments of clarity where everything is clear. And I think for me, though, I treasure those when it's like, wow, okay, I get this. Something's really clear to me now. I know what I want to do.
That takes time.
No, but I think it's important to mention that this isn't a linear kind of process, for anyone out there, because I know that's immediately when someone gets frustrated because it is a circular thing. And I'm so glad that you really touched upon that because I think it takes some of the pressure off, when your things might not be as clear all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes when things are not clear, that's when a lot of the really difficult work is taking
Right.
place, right? So we're busy trying to figure out what the next steps are. We might be in that flexibility stage. Let's try this. Oh, that didn't quite work. Let's try this. That didn't quite work. Well, let's try this. That's okay. Let me go back. Maybe I need to work on my ability. I need to do some putting in golf, to get a little bit better. Right. So things come and go. And I think it's important. Yes, I do think sometimes people put really a lot of pressure on themselves to have, and I include myself on that, to have these big goals. And I think sometimes it's good to take a step back and say, wait, but hold on a second. Let's enjoy the process of getting there.
Yeah, you mentioned that as a deterrent to learning and moving forward is, I guess, self-inflicted pressure. Um, Maybe just elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I do talk about in one chapter about the two selves. This is also, again, this is an old topic of the two selves, right? People, I call them sort of the actor and the doer and the teller is how I think of it, right? So there's the doer, the one that's out there doing stuff. And then there's a teller, the one who's telling you what you've done, what you're going to do. If you want to use the word narrative, creating a narrative about your life. But a lot of times that, a lot of people have written about this, and I write about this as well. A lot of times we do stuff, and then the teller's like, well, what the heck did you just do? Why did you do that? What's wrong with you? And that's odd. Like, how would I talk to myself and be mad at myself for doing something? It's like, well, I did it. Why would I be mad at myself for not doing it or doing it a different way? And so I think that communication, when it's ideal, it's all flowing and it's all working. We're working kind of in harmony with ourselves. But when it's not, sometimes it can be difficult. And that's okay for it to be difficult. I just think it's important not to remain, to ruminate in that difficulty too long, because what happens then is it sort of drags us down. But it's okay for us to be a little bit upset that we messed up, but then we have to forgive ourselves, so to speak.
And I assume that kind of leads into, one of the principles of like flexibility, because you have to kind of do that. So I'd love to get more into that.
That's
Yeah.
an ongoing situation in life, I think. Like you have when you're younger, maybe there's a difficulty with what am I going to do for a living? I took ancient history in college, and I don't like ancient history anymore. I think you progress, and as you get older in life, things change, and there's always this adaptability. Like
Mhm.
in my category, frankly, loss is a big factor for a lot of people. You lose friends, you lose certain physical abilities, and uh, what you're talking about here applies to that, I think, as well. It's just ongoing. That's life.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in my neck of the woods as a professor, right, there's a lot of discussion about how we should teach. Right?
Mhm.
If you can get facts in a minute, right, I can just go up on Google and find a fact. Should we still teach facts or not? Should we still teach knowledge or not? Should we teach people processes? I mean, I think there's a lot of flux because there's so much information. But you do hit on an important point, which is no matter what you learn, right, whether you learn history, I was a math major for 2 years before I switched to psychology. Um, and I took a lot of biology and chemistry. I loved chemistry when I was in college and high school. What's the value of chemistry in my life? Well, I mean, maybe I don't remember the periodic table, but there are a lot of principles about how biological systems work that kind of I think about now in language, or I think about even in sports. And so I think it's important to realize that no matter what we learn as humans, we're not going to memorize everything. We're not memory machines. We're going to take that stuff, we're going to kind of sift it together, and then we're going to apply it in some weird way, and sometimes in ways that we just are unexpected. And I think that's the beauty part, is that sometimes we just take things, we put them together, and then like, whoa, where did that come from?
What you pointed out, like back in my generation, going to school, if you took history, it was all facts.
Right.
You know, 1822 in March, this happened. blah, blah. And you had to memorize all that stuff.
Right. You
And
memorized it for the test and then forgot right after.
yeah, and I realized that's not one of my strengths. I'm not, I'd rather know the story around it as opposed to, like you used to have to memorize the cause and the effect. I remember all this stuff and the dates and I'm saying, I don't, it was on June 14th or the 18th. I don't know. Who cares really? But what you said is very interesting about your world of being a professor uh, is ongoing change in terms of what's around us. Like AI now definitely has to have an impact on your world, big time.
Yeah, I mean, the AI is an interesting thing. You can get answers really well. But the other day I was trying to draw a picture of using ChatGPT of Tom Byer has done this work with little like his 16-month old son, looking at him moving around with the soccer ball and then building soccer. His whole idea is that soccer is based on the small skill of just manipulating the ball. That's the base of soccer, not kicking, not passing, not spacing, just manipulating the ball. So he has these videos of his kids when they're really, really young, walking with the ball around the house. And then you look at them a few years later and they look like prodigies. They're so good. And so I think that it's really important to think about. So anyway, I wanted to draw this figure of from soccer to tennis. And I asked ChatGPT to do that. And it just put a racket up in the middle of the air. And then it had a woman holding the racket, but there was no racket. And then the racket was somewhere else. And I'm like, well, wait, but you have to hold a racket, right? So they're trying to make AI now more human-like, so it has actual physical experiences. I don't know how you can do that if you're just, and basically in a box, essentially, with a bunch of words, text. It's hard to have that kind of experience. So yeah, AI in a way is changing the way we do things, but I'm a big proponent of HI. I still think HI has a long ways to go. And as humans, it's going to be another tool that we'll use, but it is changing how we interact with the world. But that was true from agriculture, from reading a book, right? People didn't used to read. They would just tell each other stories. Then when a book came along, some people said, well, that's going to make us lazy because I don't think anymore. I just read what somebody else wrote. So this has been happening for centuries. It's another step, but we're still around and we're still flexible and we're still
There it goes. You brought it back to flexibility. There you go.
You mentioned will and clarity. Maybe expand on the other three that you had in the mastery list.
Yeah, the ability part. I think you asked me earlier about ability, right? We all have our own natural tendencies. I think that that's true. We do have our tendencies. We can use those to our advantage. I like talking to people. So I always tell people, if I was a real language nut, I probably would speak 8, 9, 10 languages. But I actually am an extrovert. I like talking to people. And so I don't, like you, Otto, I don't want to learn all these rules. I want to go talk to people. That's what I enjoy about language. So I'm only going to learn 4. I know only, but still, right? I could know so many more. My mom practiced French when I was young. I could have learned French. I could have learned, I was with a woman from Iran. I could have learned Farsi as well, because that was a language I heard when I was a kid for a year. My mom says I spoke it. I don't remember it. But the point is, I'm an extrovert. I like language to talk to people. And so I have to just accept that that's part of my ability, right? You could call it a weakness or a strength, is that I want to talk to people. And so I want my language to be good enough so that I can have conversations. And that's my ability. That's what I have to accept. So I think that's important. Opportunity is really important, right? So people who open doors. I mean, there's so many people who've come in unexpectedly and helped me out, have opened a door for me, have said things. I mean, people who've said, I really enjoyed your book. It's so great. Thank you for this, right? Just little things that, you would think I've done this thing, but you need that support. You need that opportunity. You need those people to open doors for you. And they're really treasures, right? They really help you out. And you admire them sometimes for whatever they might have done, right? That's different than what you've done. So I think opportunity is really important. I think really you were talking about, being born with certain ability, certain in a certain place, a certain time. Opportunity is really key too.
The opportunity with language, to me at least, is you really have to have the opportunity to use the language. Because if you learn it in a classroom and you go home and you never speak Spanish, I don't think you're ever going to learn Spanish. Uh, Opinion, it's a tricky wicket.
Mhm.
Okay, so ability with opportunity. By the way, I do have your book, and I'm about a quarter of the way through it. So maybe you ought to let people know how to get your book while we're talking about your book.
Sure, they can get it at Prometheus Books. So that's Prometheus books. They can go there online or wherever they shop online.
Yeah, I
They
got a Kindle book on Amazon,
can,
um, and it looks good. I didn't have time to read the whole thing,
yeah,
but I will.
No,
I'm
but I
glad to hear
think,
that.
with all these, and especially because I, work with the older population, we're constantly trying to stress the importance of keeping your brain strong and how to really build that brain power. I mean, of course, we have all these presentations on dementia or Alzheimer's and preventing it, so I think your book is so hand in hand in that because, it's kind of taking a funner approach to things, and a more positive spin about how important it is to build a skill and just finding something new that you're into, and in doing research about you, it's just, there was so many components that you hit upon in addition to these 5 principles. And, is there different like lifestyle changes to help build your brand? Like what are your core nuggets for us?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I know, and again, I'm not an Alzheimer's dementia expert, but I do work sort of peripherally with people, and I've been to a few conferences. So I went to a conference in Austin, Texas, a couple years ago, and the first thing that kind of blew my mind was the biggest predictor. And I've told this to several people, always ask me questions about that, and I say, the biggest predictor of cognitive health in people's 70s is their physical activity in their 50s. And by physical activity, we're not talking about running a marathon. We're not talking about, I mean, now that I'm in that age range, I love playing tennis, but I don't play tennis like I used to. I'm happy if I can go out a couple times a week and play without pain, right? My knees
Or
didn't
hurting
like all
yourself.
that tennis that much. But I want to be able to walk and play tennis, right? I want to be able to do a little bit of gardening. I don't love gardening, but my wife does, so I'll go out there and do some gardening with her. Just physical movement is really important. And I think in the book, what I try to do is to tie the physical movement and to sort of mental movement, right? So we could think of thinking as mental movement, right? Simulated movement. What I mean by that is not our neurons firing, but I mean we're actually simulating as if we were in the world doing things. Like, how are we going to get somewhere? What's the answer to this question, right? So we might think of what that's related to. All of this movement is important, whether it be mental or physical.
I always say for seniors, which I'm very much so, M&Ms, mind and mobility, and whatever you can do to keep them both moving is a good thing, you know.
Mm.
But the other part of that is people know this a lot of times, but they really, again, it's how do you get people to do those things? Some people don't do that, and you wish you could get them to do it, but they don't. You know, any tips on encouraging people?
I mean, I think social connection. I mean, like, so why do, we'll go back to the language example I gave earlier. I really like talking to people. Um, I'm more of an extrovert, not a pure extrovert, but more of an extrovert. And so I like talking to people. So if I want to go learn French, then and I mean, again, when I was 20, And I was in Brazil. I had a Brazilian girlfriend. I learned Portuguese pretty fast that way.
He's like, that was a good motivator.
That was, but life changes, I learned German. It wasn't the same situation. So I had to find friends that I could talk to. I think it's really important for people to feel that they're doing this with someone else. And I do talk about how people connect to something bigger than themselves to achieve things. And sometimes we need support, we need sort of opportunity. And sometimes we need, a running buddy, or we need a walking buddy, or we need a, whatever, someone to, a book club. We're wired to connect with others. And I think sometimes we think it's just on us and it's just us. We have to do it. And as individuals.
Well, on that note, we are going to dive back into all the things to build our brain power. That's our goal of today's session. And we will continue talking with Dr. Arturo Hernandez, author and professor of psychology at the University of Houston, all about the 6 secrets to building brain power and his book. This is Project Independence in You on LIU Public Radio.
Take WCWP with you wherever you go with the WCWP app. Listen live 24/7 to all of our streams, all from one app. Plus, call the studios directly from the app and visit our social media. Download the app through the iOS App Store on Apple devices or the Google Play Store on Android by searching WCWP Radio, or visit WCWP.org for links. The WCWP app, available now on iOS and Android devices.
Welcome back to Project Independence in You on LIU Public Radio. I'm your host, Kristina Liu, with my co-host, Otto Lohse. And we are talking with Dr. Arturo Hernandez, author and professor of psychology at the University of Houston, all about the 6 secrets to building brain power and his book, Mastery. And we have to also mention, thank you for joining us from Texas. So I know you had to get up extra early for us, so thank you.
Sure, my pleasure.
So before the break, we were mentioning about just different lifestyle changes that could also enhance brain function. And I really am a huge proponent in how important socialization is. With our older population during COVID, especially, we really saw the effects that negative effects, I should say, of not having socialization and that human connection. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I know even for myself, I'm more likely to take a walk or, go to the gym if my friend calls me up and says, let's do this together. So I do think that is such a huge portion of, learning a new skill and growing in general.
I mean, I think that, I wasn't particularly athletic as a kid. My mom says I used to crawl backwards. And I was not coordinated. I was kind of pudgy. I wasn't fast. I didn't jump well. I wasn't strong. I didn't have huge endurance. I had asthma growing up. But my uncle, my mom's youngest brother, is 2 years older than me, the one that's a tennis coach now. He just loved sports. I mean, he just saw every kind of sport. You give him a ball, he could learn it in a minute. And he still does that. And I think he kind of guided me and led me, still does in a way, even indirectly, to love sports too, even though I could never be like him. And I think that's an example there of how people can take you in a different direction that you might not expect. And even though I'll never be as good as he was or as good as he is, it doesn't really matter. It's just the fact that I have like this connection to him, right? I think that's the important part, and I agree with that.
I look back in my life, and I grew up in an area where you played ball in the street, and everybody played, no matter how old you were. If they needed a player to play stick ball or punch ball or whatever ball, they would put you out on the field, stick you out there with older kids and all different age brackets. And I look back on that experience in my life, and it was really invaluable. I mean, I can't measure what I learned, but I learned, I'm sure, but that was me. I had the good fortune of having that opportunity, if you will, and it was good. I have a question for you. You mentioned several times facial recognition in your book and several things I read about you. Just elaborate on that a little bit.
So the facial recognition field is interesting because, there's this imprinting. People have heard about how ducks, right? A duck, what baby duckling's born, right? And the first thing it sees usually is the mom, and it will follow the mom around, right? So it has this imprinting that it will imprint to, and many animal species have that. They'll imprint to whatever they first see, which is usually the mother. And this was maybe 50 years ago in the 1970s. They were looking at newborns, and they began to notice that newborns would stare at faces right, a few minutes after birth, they would be staring at faces. And so they began to see whether this was true. They began to actually put faces on paddles and move them across in front of the infants, and the infants would actually follow the face, right, with their eyes. This was rediscovered in the 90s by Mark Johnson, a really famous developmental psychologist. And so this is actually like a human imprinting. We're actually born, all of us, with the ability to recognize the shape of a face and to follow it. And that seems to be a base for other things that we do later, like reading, right, where we have to recognize letters and put them together or patterns. So face recognition, it's an interesting area because it's present so early in life.
It's funny. I'll say to somebody, if I could paint, I could paint that person's face.
Right. But you can't remember their name. Right.
It struck me as interesting, that you do remember the face. A lot of people do. Some people don't. I know people who, we're sitting there and I'll say, oh, you remember blah, blah. No, they don't, the face didn't stick in their mind, but I'm sure in your world that you can get into a lot of depth on that topic. It's
face recognition is a really interesting thing. I mean, there are people who have what they call prosopagnosia. So they have face blindness is what they call it. They cannot recognize people's identity. So I think Brad Pitt says he has that.
Yes, right.
Jane Goodall, in my book, I talk about her difficulty. She thought she was just being lazy because she couldn't recognize people. So she found strategies around that, which was trying to find, maybe they have a mole, maybe they have something that they recognize, some particular thing they would focus on to remember their face, but it doesn't happen naturally, which happens to the majority of people. So yeah, it can be difficult when it doesn't come naturally.
We didn't finish your 5. We got through 3 of them so far.
We did all 5, Otto. You just weren't, we were just throwing it around. We hit all 5, Otto.
But people could find those in your book too.
Yeah, that is correct.
Which would be a good thing, right?
What I was thinking too, a lot that comes up, we were talking about, opportunity and environment and with learning a new skill, do you find that, it's equal parts genetics and, what you're exposed to, or is it, heavily weighed in one kind of area when it comes to skill?
So I think, yeah, that's the $1 million question. Right. So genetics plays a part. There's no doubt. The example that I give, that again, going back to tennis, my other love besides language, is the Bryan brothers. The Bryan brothers, both parents played professionally in college and professionally. And they set up a tennis club. They had twins, right? So there were these 2 twins that became this doubles team that was really, really good. And but they were different. So one of them was left-handed, the other was right-handed. One was actually a little bit taller, even though they're identical genetically, right? So they're identical twins, right? One of them was taller. They had different handedness. One was weaker, one was stronger. And so even when the genes are identical, and they both were very good tennis players, they played differently, right? So I think it's important to realize that even in the case where you have identical twins, and of course, another example I bring up are people that are adopted. So it's another case of 2 twins, one adopted in the US, one in China, where there were stronger differences between them because their environments were so different. So genetics plays a role. I think the other thing to understand about genetics, and again, this is from genetics experts in books that I've read, because that's not exactly my area. A lot of it is changeable. in the sense of the environment can trigger certain genes or dampen down certain genes. And so the environment, it's this dance between what we have, probably with my parents, I'm never going to be, I mean, there are some cases of people who grow to, 7 feet tall, but with my two parents, my dad was 5'10", almost 5'11". My mom was 5 foot. So I'm going to be somewhere between them, right? Unlikely that I'm going to be 6'3" and play basketball. And that's okay, right? As I note in the book, I've adapted some of my basketball skills that I learned also on the playground, sky hook particular, to some things that I do in tennis. So even though we might think of genetics as being sort of a limitation, the whole point is that as humans, we're going to take whatever we have and we're going to spin it back. And I'm back to flexibility. We're going to spin it back into some solution that works for us. And so again, right, we're really good problem solvers. That's one thing that is true of humans. And we'll find a way to solve the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to be Tiger Woods, no matter how much golf I play. I could practice 7 days a week, and I have this, view. I mean, mastery, I agree with a lot to your philosophies, but I'm not going to become Tiger Woods, no matter how hard I work at it. And that, I think, is genetics and, just the basic package that I came with.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because towards the end you'll get there. There's a really good friend that I made, Thomas Mensinger, talking about extrovert again. Tennis has also been a vehicle to meet people. And Thomas Mensinger was this tennis coach that I met in Slovenia. We met online, and then eventually he came to visit to Houston. And he came over for a few days and stayed with us. And he says, "Oh, well, let's take your kids out and let's give them some tips." And so he gave me some tips, and we're working there. And I have this scene where I'm with my kids and we're working really, really hard. And I'm really trying to take in everything he's telling me. And he's guiding them, and he corrects them so quickly, like, "Oh, do this, do that." He's like a magician out there just doing magic and getting my kids to play better. And, my daughter must have been about 4, my son about 10, and my oldest daughter about 13, 14. And so we're there, and I'm like really stressed out, and he must have felt bad for me, because he goes, "You know what? You don't realize it right now, but it's such a beautiful day, and you're here with your family playing tennis." And he kind of marked that moment for me. And I thought, wow, now what I don't remember what he was teaching my kids or what I learned that day. I do remember that it was a beautiful moment and that he said that. And it was. Two of my kids were playing on one court. And then he was with my youngest daughter, and he was just kind of helping her out. And it was just like a beautiful moment. So even though, I was worried about exactly how good they were going to be,
that's my view with
really
golf,
matter in the end.
especially as I got older. I've had the opportunity to play with my son and my grandsons and whatnot, and had the opportunity to play in many, many places because of business. We always had nice places to have sales meetings, and I had the opportunity. And that's the part I look at is the opportunity that it gave me. Not that I'm going to be a great golfer. I enjoy the game, but the surroundings and the people part of it were really the part that I remember. I had one hole in one in my life. I remember that, but beyond that, and I had a couple of good rounds here and there, but I had a lot of bad rounds too.
But you had fun doing it, Otto. That's all that matters.
Like you said, a lot of beautiful moments. Yeah, and I think that's part of the acceptance, that you have to go through also.
Absolutely.
It's all good stuff.
That's right. But I think that's just the overall. And that's why I love all the 5 principles, because it really, it's not, this pressure of, my God, you hear mastery, you're like, oh my God, I got to, master a skill. But I think it's the process of this and just learning and trying something new, right? And just being part of the process is the fun of it, and strengthening your brain and your overall health in general.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. We do we do tend to set these goals for ourselves, but the interesting thing is that we'll deviate. One example was actually someone who did pick up golf, Dan McLaughlin, who decided he was going to become a golf pro, got really, really good, really good. People were amazed at how good he got, but eventually he threw his back out and he couldn't play anymore. But then he set up a business using the same kinds of the same types of things he did for golf, where he was keeping track of statistics and having a plan and having a practice plan and all of this and a coach. He used all those organizational skills to set up a business making drinks that he started doing in his kitchen. And then eventually he set up a business with that. So we can take whatever we learned and we can sort of reuse it, repurpose it for something else. So yeah, that's the kind of beauty. That's the magic part.
That's the
part
part
we
of the
forget
book
about
I
sometimes.
just get into. I saw the chart of his handicaps and the 5,000 hours or whatever he put into
Yeah, he
development.
did.
Yeah. I see. I know I'm not going to commit 5,000 hours to golf. I probably have over my lifetime. Because I've been playing since I'm a teenager. And it's just fun.
Yeah, I've probably put in about 30,000 hours of tennis, you know,
Yeah.
and finally after 30,000, I feel like I'm, pretty good. So
You
sometimes
had your clarity. There it is. But
all
I
good.
do think I like that whole message. And I think especially for our senior populations, I always say we're so fortunate, especially in the town that we live in, because we have such a really strong base of our seniors, right? That have had come from all walks of life, all different careers. And I love the idea of, you don't really know that you might be taking the skills that you had as a teacher or something and just putting them to something new. And I think that is the sweet spot of all of this, is that, when you're doing things, I even know with myself, listen, I went to school originally for marketing. Then I took a sociology class, and then I was like, oh, I really like this. And then I ended up in social work, and, but in my current job, so much of my things that I enjoyed of marketing and creativity, I was able to kind of apply into, the world that I work in. And I think that is the sweet spot and the great thing about life and learning and trying new things.
Well, I'm sorry. No, you're a professor of psychology, and you've applied this to a lot of really practical things in life, in my judgment. And I was always interested in psychology. I was in sales, and I took it as a serious profession, and I wanted to learn about communicating and how people thought, and, in a positive way. And I'm sorry I never took one of your classes.
Well, my class is the last one. I've been told that I teach cognitive psychology, which is a lot of the stuff in the book, how you think, how you remember, how you recognize faces. Unfortunately, I've been told that my class is the second hardest after calculus in their undergraduate careers. And it's because they really get down to the nitty gritty of sort of breaking down the mind into all these different tools you use that are very analytical. So I hope that you would enjoy my class, but I couldn't guarantee it because only a few people say they enjoy my class.
He said, you haven't mastered that skill yet, Otto,
No, but I find it very interesting how the mind works. And let's face facts. That's what we walk around with every day. Yeah.
Well, we could talk to you certainly for hours about all of this good stuff. And we'd like to thank our guest today, Dr. Arturo Hernandez, author and professor of psychology at the University of Houston. We talked all about his book, Mastery, How Learning Transforms Our Brains, Minds, and Bodies. And you can get that anywhere books are sold. We would like to thank you and everyone who joined us today. You're listening to Project Independence U on LIU Public Radio. Thank you again.